Jewish Insights with Justin Pines on JBS is made possible in part by the clubs at Pearl River, New York, luxury rental communities for ages 55 and better, and the B.L. Manger Foundation.
Shalom and welcome to Jewish Insights. If you've been watching the show or listening to the show, you know that I'm very interested in the calendar. The way the calendar raises different questions for us different times of the year. And I feel that's true not only for the Jewish calendar, but also for the calendar of the world and the country that we live in. And this is the time of the year where we're thinking about Martin Luther King Jr. As we celebrate his birthday, and as we think about his legacy and his life and his effect on not only America, but specifically the Jewish people as well. Those who also know me will discuss hopefully today one of his sermons, The Drum Major Instinct, introduced to me by Rabbi David Jaffe, is one of the most influential sermons I've heard from any rabbi or non-rabbi in the world. And I think that speaks to the importance and the effect of Dr. King on everyone. If you've been watching JBS, my guest today is certainly no stranger to JBS, and I'm excited for him to discuss the life and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. For the past 30 years, Rabbi Marc Schneier has been a leader in helping to improve the relationship of key ethnic groups and faith communities, and is responsible also for founding and leading one of the most dynamic synagogues in the United States, the Hampton Synagogue, which he founded in 1990 and where he serves today as senior rabbi. If you watch JBS, you know you can see religious services from the Hampton Synagogue, Rabbi Schneier's sermons, other events, book talks, lectures, concerts, weekly, monthly, all the time on JBS. We're so thrilled to be partners with the Hampton Synagogue. In addition to all of his work in the Hampton Synagogue, or as part of that as well, in 1989, Rabbi Schneier founded the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding, originally to rebuild the historic Black-Jewish alliance in the United States, and for the past 15 years to build Muslim-Jewish relations globally. He's written 2 books as part of that effort and done many, many things that we could spend hours speaking about, but we're going to focus on Dr. King today mostly. With Imam Shamsi Ali, he is the author of Sons of Abraham, a candid conversation about the issues that divide and unite Jews and Muslims. And now, as we celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we also celebrate the 25th anniversary of this seminal work, Shared Dreams, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Jewish Community, which includes a preface by Martin Luther King III and documents Dr. King's relationship with the Jewish community and the way they inspired one another. Rabbi Schneier, thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure.
Really thrilled.
It's good to be back.
It's good to have you back. It's good to see you. My first question, I think, someone who doesn't know you well knows Hampton Synagogue. Someone who knows you a little bit better knows about all the work you've done around creating relationships across ethnic groups. Talk to me about that. How did you get involved in this work in the first place? I didn't realize you found the foundation before you even founded Hampton Synagogue. How did you end up on this path, and what made it interesting for you?
Well, I come from a very unique rabbinic tradition. I'm the 18th generation of rabbis now in my family. Wow. But I come from a...
First of all, I didn't know 18 years. I knew a few generations. 18 years? Back to which country? 18 generations, sorry. Back to... Does that take us back to Mitzrayim?
All right. Russia, Austria, and then here in New York.
Wow. Wait, can I ask how far, what century are we talking about?
We're talking about the 1500s.
Wow. Amazing. That is cool. Okay. All right. I didn't know. I knew you were a rabbinic family. I didn't know 18 generations. That's something.
18 generations.
Okay. Sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
But I also come from a rabbinic tradition where you have to make a sizable contribution, not only as a pastor to your congregation, but to the Jewish community at large. Mm-hmm. And you need to find that synthesis in terms of congregational involvement and social action. Mm-hmm. So here I was in the late 1980s. Mm-hmm. I had just received my ordination, smicha from Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik in 1983 at Yeshiva University. I joined my father as his assistant at Park East Synagogue, and I was looking for a social action cause where I can make a difference. And it was at that time that we had a very distinguished member of the congregation who I not only grew up with, but I actually worked for him in 1976 in Washington as a congressional intern. Then it was Congressman Ed Koch. He became Mayor Ed Koch.
Wow.
And we were extremely, extremely close. And in January 1988, Ed Koch had a Martin Luther King commemoration at City Hall, and he invited me to offer the invocation. Now, most viewers know me in terms of that watch me on JBS,
Right.
my affinity for music and liturgical music, and I literally had an epiphany that day at City Hall. I heard the boys' choir of Harlem singing, not "We Shall Overcome," but the other anthem of the civil rights movement, "Lift Every Voice and Sing." And I had this epiphany, and it piqued my curiosity about Martin Luther King, about Black-Jewish relations, what happened, the whole thing. And I also had another dear friend at the time who was a member of Parkey Synagogue, the late Joseph Papp. People remember Papp either for what he did for the Shakespearean Festival, the great Broadway impresario, but Joe Papp was also the pioneer of colorblind casting. When you speak with the James Earl Jones, you speak with the Denzel Washington, they'll tell you, had not been for Papp, they never would have had the opportunity to perform Shakespearean roles that had been reserved exclusively for white actors. So Papp was interested in joining forces with me in creating some kind of foundation that would promote ethnic understanding, ethnic harmony. I said, Joe, why don't we focus specifically on rebuilding the historic alliance between blacks and Jews? I'd done my research. I discovered that when you carefully examine the civil rights struggles of the 1950s and 60s, there was no segment of American society that provided as much and as consistent support to Dr. King and to the black community as did the Jewish community. And then sadly and tragically, after King's assassination, that alliance spiraled downward, and it was time to create an organization that would focus exclusively on repairing and rebuilding that historic alliance that was responsible for bringing about so many great social and political changes in our nation. So with my now adding on the foundation, as a rabbi, my mandate was now fulfilled. At the time, I was making my congregational contribution at Parkey Synagogue, and through the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding, I could then begin to work nationally in terms of social action.
Beautiful. Okay. Thank you for filling that in. That's really interesting. Let's talk a little bit around, you mentioned the beautiful relationship, which I think, everyone, it's like Heschel and Dr. King, or like they have that image, but most people don't know past that. So let's spend a little bit of time kind of understanding that history, and then maybe you could also get to why you think it spiraled downward after that. So
sure.
Bring us in. Tell us about Black-Jewish relations and relationships between the Jewish community and Dr. King.
Well, when you think back, you think of that iconic image of Heschel and King marching together. But it is, there's a far more vast history in terms of the singular role played by the Jewish community, its leadership, and its rabbis.
Sure.
The fact that the Freedom Rides, the college students that came down from the north to the south to help blacks register to vote, more than 70% of the students on those Freedom Ride buses were Jews. You look at some of the leading rabbis of that generation that gave moral witness in the South, in St. Augustine, in Alabama, and Mississippi, and Atlanta. Rabbis, who came down from the North, to support Dr. King and the black community, but we need to also remember that the door was swinging both ways. I often say that if people who fight for their rights, for their own rights, Justin, are only as honorable as when they fight for the rights of all people.
Sure.
And Martin Luther King Jr. not only championed the civil rights of blacks, but of Jews as well. He was a tireless advocate in support of the State of Israel. His involvement in the plight of Soviet Jewry, which was the cause célèbre of the Jewish community at the time, his many, many references to the Holocaust, that I document in my book, and his total disdain, his zero tolerance for anti-Semitism, particularly when that began to emerge within the black militant movement towards the end of his life. So that Martin Luther King Jr. was not only a great civil rights leader for the black community, but he also fought for the civil rights of Jews as well.
Beautiful. I have a few follow-up questions we'll do in different directions here. The first, you paint a beautiful picture. I know you also in the book go into kind of that it was not a simple all Jews got on board at the time. And I've had my own children ask me often, we talk about the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, being slaves in Egypt and what that was like, and I tell them about racial history and civil war in America, and they always ask me, what sides were the Jews on in the Civil War? What side were they in the civil rights movement? Share a little bit around kind of the different factions of the Jewish world, right? 2 Jews, 3 opinions. What were the different factions of the Jewish world when it came to the work that Dr. King was doing? Where did they show up and what was driving their different approaches?
First, you had the Jewish community in the South that was somewhat divided in terms of its support for Dr. King. They were living, in this racially segregated society, and they were concerned in terms of their own welfare, their own well-being. I would say probably the most credit in terms of rabbinic leadership should go to the Reform and the Conservative movement. The Orthodox community was mixed in terms of its support. I think at the time the Orthodox community was concerned about its own future here in the United States. It's not the Orthodox Jewish community of today, so therefore fighting for others was not as much a priority. But thank God, we have a tradition and we have a value system that we are always fighting for those who are less fortunate. Remember, King often referenced and used the exodus from Egypt and the slavery experience of the Israelites as a metaphor. Remember that you too were strangers in Egypt, and this is something that we have championed. I can tell you that several years ago, when American Muslims came under attack in terms of the Trump administration. When you spoke with most American Muslim leaders, they would tell you at the time that the greatest defenders of the American Muslim community happens to be the Jewish community. This is our place. This is where we always need to be. This is our mandate. This is our social consciousness. And we should be very, very proud that the Jewish community, way out of proportion of our numbers, I think at the time we were maybe 0.2% of the American population, and yet 70% of college students heading down to the South to help blacks register to vote were Jews. So I think it's something that we need to continue to celebrate, and we need to keep reminding not only ourselves, but our black brothers and sisters of the singular role that was played by the American Jewish community at the time.
Sure, and you lay out beautifully in the book how, at least you didn't say it explicitly, but I felt like I noticed the theme that there were some of these rabbinic figures who kind of put their necks out there that did come and say, I want to be alongside Dr. King, and you had presidents of synagogues or congregants kind of coming back after them, either saying, you're up the north writing these letters, you don't know anything, stay away from here, or even fellow people down south saying, stay away. And first of all, I recognize that as such a powerful thing for a rabbinic leader to step out forward. And I think you're right. I remember a rabbi I heard speak at a conference once said, no one ever looked back on their career and regretted doing the right thing, no matter what happened to them.
Look, I remember back in 1989, 1990, when I began this journey in Black-Jewish relations. It was very controversial at the time. Probably the lowest point ever in the state of Black-Jewish relations in this country was August 1991, the Crown Heights riots.
Right.
And here is
Say a word about that in case any viewers don't know.
Yes, the Crown Heights riots, when there was a terrible accident in Crown Heights as the Lubavitcher Rebbe was being driven back to his headquarters, and a black youth was killed, and it was 3 or 4 days of massive riots, if not even I would even label it as a pogrom, which was probably the lowest point ever in the state of Black-Jewish relations in our country. Nevertheless, here was this young Orthodox, maverick rabbi saying, no, we need to rebuild, we need to repair Black-Jewish relations. I remember in 1997, 1998, I convened the first national conferences on Black-Jewish relations at Yeshiva University. And I did this with Dr. Norman Lamb. And to my pleasant surprise, I thought maybe he was going to exile the conference, either to the Midtown campus, to the, at the time, the law school campus at 55, Fifth Avenue, Lower Manhattan. Nope, we're having it right at the main campus, right near, the Beit Midrash, the rabbis, the students, they all need, and we had, who were the personalities? We had Jesse Jackson.
Wow.
We had Kwasi Mfume, the head of the NAACP. I remember Dr. Norman Lamb introducing Reverend Jackson, saying, you are one of my inspirational orators and speakers. I mean, it was like a love fest. Wow. We're talking 1997.
Wow.
We had Bill Gray, who was at the time the head of the United Negro College Fund. All these great African-American leaders that spoke at the main campus of Yeshiva University, but someone, had to take that journey and that dive. And I went through the same thing in terms of my work in Muslim-Jewish relations. Not exactly, particularly now, I wouldn't say it's not the most, popular issue. I wouldn't say exactly at the top 10 of priorities within the Jewish community, but it must be done. It needs to be done.
Wow. All right, and then so let's try to break it down a little bit, because you talk through different themes in your book, and I think they're all relevant today. One is kind of the people to people relations, and then we can get to the religious and theology piece of it. What is it that Jews, you felt like at the time, felt like our value is to help those in need, let's go help? Are there elements of this was good for both groups, or is an element of we have shared challenges? Like, talk to me about how the community is connected.
I think that for the Jewish community, it was about our responsibility, our social responsibility, following the calling of our ancient Hebrew prophets. I often refer, a king was mesmerized by Isaiah, by Amos, by Amos, by Micah. And I've always referred to those prophets as God's angry prophets. Injustice made them angry. Oppression made them angry. Human cruelty, dishonesty made them angry. And I often comment that the word anger, A-N-G-E-R, is only one letter removed from the word danger, D-A-N-G-E-R. So anger, it's a mixed emotion. It can also lead to destruction. It can lead to broken families. But look at how anger was used to challenge the Jewish people back in the days of the prophets, and look how the way it's been used to challenge the Jews throughout our history here. So I think it's very, very important to understand that Jews at the time, we recognized you could not have turned on your television and seen the way the blacks were being treated and were being lynched. And as a Jew with that kind of value system, not to be moved in terms of wanting to actualize and to act on the need for equality, for freedom, for righteousness, for justice at the time. Sure. So I think it was more that. What I've tried to do in my book is to also represent that it was a two-way street.
Right. Same.
It was not only about what Jews did for blacks, it was about what the head of the civil rights leader, Martin Luther King Jr., what he also did for Jews. I mentioned before about Israel, about Soviet Jewry, about the Holocaust, about fighting anti-Semitism. And this was the great leader of the black community who took out the time to channel his anger when it came to injustices against the Jewish people, against the state of Israel. So that's the way I tried to present it. Sure. But at the time, I think it was more about the Jewish community feeling that sense of responsibility to help those who are not being treated in a righteous and in a just manner.
Beautiful. So, and you mentioned a little bit earlier around within the Jewish community, some of the hesitation was people who lived in the South and already had, they had priorities that perhaps misguided them. Some felt like they were worried about their own community and they might have some hesitation, but for the most part, most Jews stepped forward. On the flip side of it, you mentioned Dr. King's commitment to the Jewish people, the state of Israel, anti-Semitism, and that involved some political risk as well within his own community. Lay out for us a little bit, why was that politically risky, and what were the challenges within the black community when they were thinking about the Jewish community? What was causing that friction?
Well, I think there was less risk when it came to referencing the Holocaust, but there was greater risk when it came to fighting anti-Semitism, because he took on particularly the more militant younger members of the civil rights movement. That's one. And also, after the 6-Day War, within the black community, Israel was no longer the David. It was now the Goliath.
Switch teams, the problem we have today.
Exactly, and I think that also was a cause. And I point out, interestingly enough, in my book that this year when we commemorate King's birthday, the same day as Trump's inauguration, Donald Trump, because I participated in the conference in 2018 in Bahrain, the Peace to Prosperity Conference, when Trump envisioned, or Jared Kushner at the time, that the way to bring about a lasting peace between Israel and its neighbors, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, etc., is through prosperity. It was Dr. King in 1966 who first proposed peace through prosperity in the region. He went, sent Andrew Young went with him to Jordan, and he tried to convince both the Jordanian and Israeli governments in '66 to join forces in creating peace through prosperity. The prosperity would be to have all these different pilgrimages, both to Jordan and to Israel. And King speaks about that the way to bring these enemies, these foes together would be through prosperity, through economics. So with all due respect, to President Trump, it was in '66. It was Martin Luther King Jr. who first put forth the idea of peace through prosperity in the Middle East.
Wow, I did not know that. That's fascinating. And it makes sense when you say it out loud, and certainly there are areas where it feels like I'd love to see more peace through prosperity. We haven't seen that in Gaza, obviously, but throughout the Middle East.
Yeah. Not yet.
Right. One more I wanted to ask that seemed to come through in your book was kind of a sense that there was, separate from the political spectrum, there was also some theological anti-Semitism within the black community at the time. Certainly kind of like the old narratives of like Jesus killer stuff. Like, do you see that as part of more extreme black movements alongside King that he was facing?
Not only extreme, more fringe.
More fringe.
Fringe.
Okay,
King was so pronounced, he was so greatly influenced
Yeah.
by the prophets of Israel.
Yeah.
Whether it's the I Have a Dream speech,
Right.
his last speech, I've been to the mountaintop.
Sure.
I've seen the promised land.
Yeah.
His letter from a Birmingham jail,
Right.
where he quotes and references, Isaiah and Micah, the 8th century BCE prophets.
Yeah.
That were forced to leave their homes to bring forth the message of God, like I am forced to bring forth, the message of freedom.
Sure.
To leave my home here in Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
He was so, not only well versed, but he was so steeped in that theology of the ancient Hebrew prophets that it was probably a Judeo-Christian ethic in the truest sense of the word.
Wow, beautiful. Right, we had Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamb, you mentioned Norman Lamb, his grandson, on recently talking about the way Judeo-Christian ethic shaped even, the Mayflower, like this from the beginning here. And it's very interesting to frame it as thinking about a lot of what Dr. King's approach, and certainly his sermons, were steeped in theology in that way. Did he acknowledge that? Did he openly say that he was influenced by Jewish thought?
Yes, not only did he speak about that, but he exhorted black audiences. And there are quotes in my book where he says, you look at the Jewish people and look at their history, and look at their persecution, look at their oppression, and look at their subjugation, and look at their coercion, and look at their exile. But they never use that as an excuse not to succeed, so that he used Jewish history as a role model for blacks, despite all the suffering, despite all the challenges. If the Jewish people could overcome what they overcame, then the black community can do the same.
Great. So I love that language, and I want to ask a nuanced question. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What you just said typically is not like, I've heard Jewish people say that before. It's one thing for a person of color to say that about the Jewish community and be inspired, but sometimes you hear Jewish people, again, fringe, but you hear Jewish people saying that about the community of color. Like, we figured it out. We came to America, we, bootstrap, we did it, the whole thing. Like, why can't the black community figure it out?
There's one big flaw.
I'm sure several. Please.
No, there's
just one?
There's one major flaw.
Yeah.
And I wrote about this 25 years ago. It was published in every Jewish publication around the world at the time, because we used very often the Passover experience as a shared experience between blacks and Jews. Just like we were oppressed and we were slaves for 210 years, blacks were oppressed in slavery for more than 200 years in the South. But there's a big difference. The big difference was the experience post-slavery. Right. Look at the Jewish experience. What happened, according to our tradition? God takes the Jewish people out of Egypt. He literally puts them in quarantine for 40 years, to the extent that not a single member of that slavery generation could enter the Promised Land.
Right.
What happened here in the States? Suddenly blacks are emancipated, they're free, and they're told, now go rebuild your lives among the very same taskmasters that enslaved you, that oppressed you. I don't know if the Jewish people could have overcome such a challenge. It's very, very unfair to make that comparison and to make those comments from a post-slavery point of view. We literally had to, I'll use the term, we literally had to whitewash that whole slavery generation before they could then rebuild their lives in the Promised Land. That was not the case here in America. In America, suddenly you had to rebuild your lives among the very people that enslaved you, that beat you, that owned you. I don't know if any people could have emerged the way the black community has in this country. So if anything, I think we should tip our hat and we should applaud the advancement that the black community has made despite that Herculean challenge of rebuilding your life among the very people that enslaved you.
Beautiful. I think it's such an important point, and you laid it out so nicely, right? Being able to hold both those, that there's what that for the black community to learn from the Jewish community without saying that they're the same at all and recognizing they're totally different. I'll flip the question around now as well. You've been thinking about this for 25 years more at this point. I guess I'm doing my math. And even before the foundation began, what do you feel like, and you talked also about the ways in which the Jewish community showed up for the black community during the time of MLK, Dr. King. Tell me a little bit about what the Jewish community learned in the past and what the Jewish community might learn from the black community. Let's start with MLK's time, but you could talk about moving forward as well. What's for us, how should we, you said they were inspired by our slave experience to think about their framework. It's not the same, but there's what to learn.
Correct.
What do we have to learn from them?
Well, I think what you can learn from Martin Luther King.
Yeah, great.
Is that,
there.
Yeah.
Good topic for today.
I think what you can learn from Martin Luther King, that the difference the individual can make, that movements can transform societies, the importance of working with others, that there's no way that the black community would have achieved what it has achieved. There would never have been a Barack Obama had not been for the Jewish community. The partnership, the historic alliance between blacks and Jews brought about the greatest social and political changes in our nation, but you can't fight the fight alone. You can't fight the fight alone, and that's something that the Jewish community needs to recognize. That particularly in these very, very difficult and trying times, we need friends, we need allies, and we need to keep working at it. I think that's one lesson you can take away from the civil rights struggle. And
as a rabbi who delivers divrei Torah, as we say, speeches from the pulpit, what are your takeaways from studying Dr. King's skills and abilities as an orator? How do you take that with you to your pulpit when you speak every Shabbat?
Well, I take not only Dr. King, but some of my other friends in the black community. I've been on programs where I've been sandwiched. When Reverend Jackson Sr. used to have his Wall Street conference, and he had his ministers' luncheon. For 10 consecutive years, he had me speaking, where the lineup was Sharpton, then T.D. Jakes, then Schneier, and then Jackson. Now, you're talking about three of probably the greatest orators in terms of preachers, in this country today. And I've learned a lot, from that whole style of preaching. In terms of the refrain, in terms of calling out someone in the audience. Okay, Sally, are you following me? Richard, did I right in the middle of my sermon? Right in the middle of my sermon. But I'm not this lengthy a speaker. I often remind my assistant rabbis that for a sermon to be memorable, it need not be eternal. All right? So I never speak for more than 12 minutes. Rosh Hashanah, I'll speak for maybe 18 to 20 minutes. But every Shabbat. But as you know, that 12 minutes is far more challenging than rambling, for 25 or 30 minutes. So in terms of King's oratory, it was once in a generation. But he had the rhythm, he had the cadence, and people at the Hampton Synagogue will tell you very often that they find my style of preaching to be very Southern Baptist, and there's no question that in terms of spending, a year and a half researching this book in Atlanta and my relationship with other black leaders, and black preachers, that they've had a tremendous influence on my public speaking.
Beautiful, and I love that particularly that piece around connecting meaningfully with the audience. You know, I remember the first time I listened to a recording of one of Dr. King's speeches. Like, it took me a few minutes. People were like talking during the speech, and I didn't understand. And then I made out that it was that they would say, like, say it plain, things like that. You know, it was almost this like call and response, and it's a beautiful thing to imagine. You know, we imagine, you know, the cliche, a rabbi's up in front of a whole room, and everyone's, you know, getting their Shabbat afternoon nap in, let's say, for lack of a better term, and you know what it might be like to, like you say, call out a person in the crowd, or to have them voice their opinion about what you're saying over the course of the speech.
No one sleeps during my service.
Except for yours, of course. No one sleeps during any.
No, it's not that. It's just that this is my style.
Right.
Of preaching.
To try to preach, right. To
this preach. Is, you know, as you know, being a rabbinic graduate, at least at Yeshiva University, you had two different tracks, the pulpit track or the educational track. But even the students who went on the pulpit track still view themselves more as teachers.
Sure.
I'm a preacher. Unfortunately, in the American Orthodox rabbinate, there are very few preachers today. And I think people appreciate the amount of work. If I speak for 12 minutes every week, I will spend a minimum of 10 hours a week preparing for those 12 minutes, where every word has to count, every nuance, every cadence. There's a certain rhythm. I have different outlines. You know, I do not speak from notes. Unlike some of my conservative reform colleagues, I don't have a teleprompter, which is becoming even more popular today.
Sure.
But I think I've mastered this art of preaching because of my engagement with some of the leading black preachers in this country.
Beautiful. And just say, I think I understand what you mean, but when you say you're a preacher and not an educator, is that about the methodology in which you deliver the speech, or it's also about the educational goals of the speech?
No, I think in terms of the methodology, and thank you for clarifying that.
Okay.
No, listen, I can teach as, you know, I spent enough years preparing, you know, for this role. But in terms of my methodology, look, you know, I'm very blessed, you know, with my cantor and my choir.
Sure.
And we play
as are we.
and we really play off ourselves.
Beautiful.
But we have to, whether it's myself, the cantor, and the choir, we have to be at our best. I find that this art of preaching is very, very effective within the Jewish community. People find it very enthralling, very refreshing. There's a lot to be said to it.
So I'll go one question deeper. Give me just, you referenced them, but kind of if someone was asking you what are the key features of preaching, what would you say they are?
Turning phrases.
What does that mean?
I just gave a sermon on how casual Jews become Jewish casualties. Just that one phrase.
That piece of it, something that you can grab onto.
Game over. Game over.
I love that.
I'm always turning a phrase.
Right, finding a phrase to turn.
Always.
Beautiful.
That's something else I learned from watching my friends Jackson and Sharpen.
Got it.
Yeah, turning a phrase.
I like that. Beautiful.
Something as simple as that. I've had rabbis say to me, you're at a rabbinic convention, and they'll hear someone speak this, and say, okay, Mark, now how would you have summarized that 10-minute sermon in one sentence?
Right.
Okay? It's knowing how to turn that phrase.
Beautiful. Okay, I love that. All right, I want to come back to our story for a few minutes. So you mentioned this amazing relationship that is often overlooked, and that it's about politically working together, but also exchange of ideas, and the way Dr. King was influenced by theology. And then you mentioned kind of almost like a cliff that it fell off after his death.
Yep.
Say a little bit about that and what happened.
Well, with King's
assassination,
tragic assassination, left a terrible void. And the more militant wing of the black community began to emerge. They identified the time with the Palestinian liberation movement. It was very controversial, Israel supplying arms to South Africa at the time, which created a lot of tension between blacks and Jews. Then you had Andrew Young, I think it was in 1977, when he was the ambassador to the United Nations under President Carter, met secretly with the representative of the PLO. I mean, again, you have to understand this, appreciate this within the context of 1977. Then you had Reverend Jackson's Hamitown comment, 1984, and then with the emergence of Louis Farrakhan, who I've had quite a history with, which is also well documented in terms of some very controversial engagements he and I have had. And probably the lowest point, not probably, the lowest point, Crown Heights, 1991. And that's when we really mobilized and intensified our efforts, and there were enough not only leaders in both communities, but even influencers who understood that something needs to be done here. And I can proudly say today, despite the most recent war Israel is now engaged in, that I would still define Black-Jewish relations today as being in a state of cooperation and not a state of conflict. At least, look, minimally on the leadership level. I think if you look at the Jewish congressional delegation and the Congressional Black Caucus, if you look at many of the Black civil rights leaders today, whether it's the NAACP, the National Urban League, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and others, they are aligned, with the Jewish community, despite the challenges we're going through with Israel right now.
Right.
So we've come a long way since 1968, after King's assassination. But I think our really big challenge is the fact that you're dealing with a generation in the Black community today that doesn't have the historical reference.
Right.
They see Martin Luther King Jr. as their Moses, but they really are ignorant in terms of what he had to say about the Jewish community, about the state of Israel. And that a responsibility we have, to go out and to educate and to sensitize people to the role that he played in terms of not only with the Jewish community, but again, his greatness, that he not only fought for the civil rights of Blacks. As I said, he fought for the civil rights of all people.
Sure. It's interesting. First of all, I'm very encouraged to hear the narrative you just shared, because I certainly felt like certain colleagues of mine that felt like they worked hard to have allyship across different groups, felt like they were at the front lines for Black Lives Matter, for example, and felt very abandoned after October 7th, that a lot of their partners
You should know, Black Lives Matter is somewhat controversial within the Black community.
Please.
I mean, I remember confronting a very, very significant Black leader about certain comments, anti-Semitic comments, rhetoric, diatribe coming out of Black Lives Matter. And his response to me was, well, since when does Black lives matter? Meeting you meeting the Jewish community, others, you take them more seriously than you should, or you're being a little overly sensitive, or this and that. Look, I think Reverend Sharpton is a great example. I remember where he was back in '91 during the Crown Heights riots. We didn't know each other at the time.
Sure.
And then in 2019, right before COVID, when there were all these attacks that were being perpetrated within the Black community against Jews, the one who stood with me publicly, it was all over the news, not only denouncing but renouncing these attacks on the Jewish community by Blacks, was Al Sharpton, who was unequivocal in speaking out against anti-Semitism. So, people evolve, people do change, You have to stay at it. I think people will respect you if when you demonstrate your own convictions and you're not afraid to disagree, but one can be, we can agree to disagree without being disagreeable. But I'm very, very blessed. I enjoy that respect and that honor among the black leadership of this country. But look, I've proved myself now for 35 years.
Sure.
But I know that when the Jewish community is in need of black support on the highest level, it's a matter of 2 or 3 phone calls for me. Yep.
Beautiful. And I know that you said a lot of the resources have been shifted to focus on Muslim-Jewish relations, but I want to stick with black-Jewish relations a little bit longer and say where we are, I guess we're in 2025 apparently, is that right? 2025. Thinking about MLK's birthday, Dr. King's birthday, what do you see as kind of the next chapter or the pressing issues unfolding among the black and Jewish community? Where's that going? What are the challenges? What do you see as what's next?
Well, the first challenge is that the Jewish community must recognize we cannot fight our battles alone. The importance of alliance building. Look at the United States Congress today. I think the majority of members in the House, at least within the Democratic Party, are men and women of color who don't have this historical reference. Forget about what King had to say, who really don't understand, appreciate the role that the Jewish community played in terms of their freedoms, their liberties, their advancement, their opportunities. And that's why we need to, intensify those kinds of outreach efforts. I mean, at the end of the day, what does the Jewish community need? Okay, we need support when it comes to combating anti-Semitism. We need support when it comes to strengthening Israel. These are our top 2 issues. For other ethnic communities, for other minorities, they have issues of social welfare. They have issues of education, hunger. So there needs to be a quid pro quo. But I think it's important that leaders of other communities be reminded of the role that we played in terms of their opportunities and their advancement.
Beautiful. Okay, in our final few minutes, I want to shift to my favorite sermon, the drum major instinct. I'll review for our viewers. I know you're familiar, but this is in Ebenezer Baptist Church in February of 1968, and it's a very powerful sermon in which he talks about what he calls the drum major instinct, the idea that each of us have an instinct to be, in his example, the drum major. And the drum major in that case is the person in the band who's at the very front.
Correct.
Right, and that there's a human desire for recognition and importance, which is an important drive, if I understand him correctly. I don't like trying to summarize Rebbe's, but I'll try to summarize. And the key, I think I understand him saying, is clarifying in which areas we want to seek recognition and importance, and if we can direct them to the right areas.
Right, how you channel.
Yeah, exactly. Do you want to be known because you have the biggest house, or you want to be known because you, I guess, made peace in the world, that kind of thing? And
right,
who are you jealous of? Exactly.
You know how I would say, you want me to turn another phrase for you, it's a sermon about values and not valuables.
Interesting.
That's
Beautiful.
the sermon.
Right.
Values and not valuables.
Right.
It's about worth and not wealth.
Right.
And what he was referring to, that yes, I will be the drum major when it comes to speaking out against injustice.
Yeah.
When we come to speaking out, for peace. When it comes to righteousness, again, echoing the words of the Hebrew prophets. But it's how you channel your values, not your valuables.
Sure. I love, first of all, a beautiful turn of phrase. Right. And I would, and I think there's also, I think the second element for me is that it's recognizing, like, I don't want to use the word jealousy, but in some ways when jealousy can be good, when that
It's like anger.
Right, exactly. It's like
another perfect example. Jealousy can also be a very powerful force, let's say purely from a competition point of view.
Right.
Just like, again, I gave the example before of anger, remember? It's one letter removed from the word danger.
Right.
But the ancient prophets were God's angry people.
Sure.
And it was their anger that challenged the Jewish people to address, the wrongs of society at the time.
Beautiful. And I think the sense of you want something that gets you out of the bed because you're excited to get after it, and you're either not necessarily jealous, but you're seeking that thing.
Passion.
Right, passion for something where it might come with some sense of honor or recognition or those kind of things, but the goal, like you said, is the mission, the value, what you're getting after.
Yeah, and really converting the power into a sense of purity.
Right. So I'm going to ask the drum major on you, because you rub shoulders with people. You go to White House parties. You met prime ministers. You meet with important people across the world. You're the head of the Hampton Synagogue, which I'm going to imagine there might be some players who come into that synagogue. I'm just going to project and guess for a second. How do you think about navigating those questions? What checks and balances do you put on yourself? Like how do you check your driving? How do you navigate that?
It's by what can I do to make a difference for the Jewish people. When I look back, I don't know if I'd say I'm in the autumn of my life, but I'm past 65. And I look back at my legacy. I know what I built. I built a community. And with God's help, I built a community.
An amazing community.
I don't know too many rabbis that build communities from scratch. I built two movements. I built the global movement, Muslim-Jewish relations, globally. Black Jewish. I have one other very, very big idea. And it is an idea that will be the biggest thing I've ever done, if I am successful, that I believe will transform American Jewish life. I've decided just recently I'm going to pursue that as an extension of my rabbinate. You'll be hearing about it.
Oh, we're not getting a.
I wish. But
teasing our viewers. You're teasing me.
But I can tell you that no one has ever succeeded. I think it would not only transform. Look, I believe that one of the greatest challenges facing the Jewish people today, here you want to turn the phrase again, is the growing distance between the people of the book and the books of our people. And ignorance leads to indifference. Indifference leads to a loss of identity. I want to make a difference there. And I have a very, very big idea. And I'm excited. Because that's how I operate. I've always come up with those big ideas that are transformative. And I'm ready for my last hurrah.
Beautiful. First of all, I'm excited to hear that unfold, and that's great. And I think it dovetails nicely, which is a point that we didn't necessarily stress clearly, but you're really raising it, going back to Dr. King as well, because he was certainly a person of the book. He knew the book, and he drew from that, and he was able to have so much impact through knowing the book. And perhaps another lesson we take from Dr. King is that there's so much wisdom in our books for our people, for people of the world, for people of color, wherever you're coming from, to learn from, and to remind people that it's there and that they can draw from it.
And to also remind people that our mandate as Jews was not to convert the world to Judaism. It was to bring an ethical, monotheistic standard to the world, which I believe Christianity and Islam, in their purest form, are a fulfillment of that prophecy.
Sure.
And here we are in 2025. Think back 2,000 years ago when it was Judaism and everybody else. And today, we speak of not only a Judeo-Christian, but we even speak of a Judeo-Christian Islamic ethic, which to me is a fulfillment of that prophecy. So, but we are the mother religion, and everything has emerged from us. And I think the Jewish people, we should take great pride. King's greatness, I don't know if Dr. King ever thought he would see the transformation he dreamed of in his lifetime. But what he did was he created a politically and socially correct standard for everyone to measure up to. That's the contribution of the Jewish people. We've created that standard. Whether people live up to it or not, that's something else.
Sure.
But that standard didn't exist 2,000 years ago, and that's why we need to continue to intensify our efforts so that more and more people recognize, embrace, and observe that standard.
I'll say amen.
Amen. Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. Thank you so much for being here. Such
Pleasure,
a treat.
Justin.
May people learn a little bit of Dr. King, a little bit about you, and may they be inspired by both of you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.